My name is Suzanne Smeaton, and I have worked in the field of picture frames for more years than I would like to admit. And I was at Eli Wilner and Company, where you were this morning at the studio. I was at Eli Wilner and Company for 27 years. So I had the good fortune of visiting hundreds, if not thousands, of collections, both public and private, and looking at a lot of frames along the way, being able to handle the objects. And as I'm sure you know, in all aspects, that's really the gold standard, is to be able to see and handle the objects. I'm sure when you were at the studio, they also encouraged and welcomed you all to go to the gallery. And any of you have not been at the gallery, it's always best to be able to look at excellent examples of whatever it is you're trying to study. And whether it's Eli Wilner and Company, or Loewy, or Gilding the Godich, and I can mention those firms to you if you're not familiar with them, I would really encourage you to do so. Museums, of course, where we have a wonderful array of museums with terrific collections here in the city and indeed in the tri-state area. But sometimes when you go to collections like that, you really don't know what it is you're looking at. And what I hope to impart to you today is not just about values, but really how to look at a frame. I'd like to build on your experience of visiting the studio today and seeing a lot of those methods in process, but also to really understand, how do I even begin to look at a frame and understand what it is that I'm looking at. I just wanted to mention the two handouts that are here. This is, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there is a wonderful book that the Appraisers Association created about appraisals, and it's a terrific compendium of essays from many, many different experts of many disciplines. And it does include a short essay by yours truly about picture frames, and it's a cursory summary. It doesn't get into numbers and valuations, but it does talk a lot about this. I did focus in this essay almost exclusively on American frames. That's really the depth of my expertise. I do know quite a fair amount about a lot of European frames, and I hope to touch on those today. But this is a good starting place to read, just to give yourself an introduction. And then the other handout is one I brought today, which are points to consider when you're looking at a frame. We'll look at images today and talk about a lot of these things, but I'll just run down the list with you. Is the frame a period frame, or a fine replica, or a reproduction? Now, when I started 25, 30 years ago, there really wasn't that distinction between fine replicas and reproductions, and that was a reflection in part of the market. Over the last several decades, though, period frames became very valuable, and a number of makers, Eli Wilner and other makers, also started making very fine replicas, and that's why they were called replicas instead of reproductions or repros. They mean the exact same thing, but it was a choice of language to distinguish between a fine replica and a repro. A repro is often a frame design, sometimes faithfully based on a historical precedent, but oftentimes over the years what happens is frame companies might borrow this element from one frame, this element from another decorative embellishment from another frame, and put them together to create a frame design that might be interesting, but it really doesn't have a historical precedent. And part of what is very important when you're navigating in this world is to be aware of the notion of what is referred to as being historically appropriate, which is to say, if you have an early 19th century American portrait, you would want a frame from the early 19th century from the same years, or a Hudson River landscape from the 1860s, American Impressionist frame, American Modernist frame from the early 20th century, things like that. So the very first thing you want to do is determine, am I looking at a period frame or not? I always tell everyone the very first thing you want to do, almost even before you look at it front on, is to look at the back. turn the frame over, only because it will tell you almost immediately, is this an old frame? Is it a new frame? You can tell by the age, the color of the wood, the fact that it's been aged. That's a really helpful thing to know. Also, when I say a fine replica, I'm talking about a very faithfully executed copy of a historical frame, a period frame, where it's carefully composed, ornaments resolve nicely. I'll touch on that briefly in the presentation, that sort of thing. And then a reproduction, again, might be faithful historically, but the finish may not be as elegant. Sometimes the ornament is not crisp or well realized. So these are things to look for. Next, is the frame original, in excellent or very good condition? Is the frame in original, excellent, very good condition? And I qualify that by saying no losses, an original gilded surface. Now, certainly not all the frames you come into contact with will be gilded objects, but a great many of them will. And becoming really familiar with gilded surfaces, if you're not already, will really serve you well. Gilded surfaces develop a really beautiful patina over time. You may have heard about this out at the studio this morning. So gilded objects develop a beautiful patina, and this can be one of the most challenging aspects in frame restoration and in frame replication, is to gild a frame but then to tone it, to patinate it so that it really has a sense of age. So when you're looking at frames, if you can discern that the surface is the original gilded surface or appears to be having a beautiful quality and apparently on the surface for a very long time, that will be really helpful. Is the frame original to the painting or of the same period? If you can determine that a frame is original to the picture, that too is really compelling evidence. There has been a lot of work over the last several decades of marrying both period frames and fine replica frames with paintings. There were so many instances of paintings having their frames removed and languishing in inappropriate frames that actually, when we were working in the early years, particularly in the late 80s and the 90s, there were a lot of curators that were learning, as we were, about what styles and frame styles were appropriate for different pictures, and making a point of carefully going through their collections, and if artworks were not appropriately framed, then doing so. So sometimes they may not have the original frame, but they could get a beautiful historically appropriate frame and put it on the picture. So when you know that a frame is original to the picture, that is certainly noteworthy. Has the frame been altered? And if yes, what is the quality of the work? Now, I can tell you that frames have been altered and put on different paintings, not for decades, but for centuries. If you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example, and go in the European wing, especially the very beautiful, elaborately carved French frames, if you look carefully, you'll often see cuts, evidence of cuts. This was a very big business, for example, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, when Bernard Berenson and Paul Auguste Ruel and some of these dealers were working. It was a big business to take frames, to alter them and put them on works. And some of those are executed beautifully, and others are just painful hatchet jobs. So you really want to notice if a frame, now sometimes you can see the cuts from the front, other times you cannot, but if you look on the back, do you all know what the term rabbet means regarding a frame? It's the channel into which the art sits. And that word rabbet seems like a strange word. It's actually derived from the term rebate, what you get back. That's a British term. So the rebate is the part that comes back, that goes over the surface of the artwork that's in the frame. So a lot of times you can look if the artwork is not in there, and sometimes you can see a bit of it, but if you turn the frame over and you look, a lot of times cuts will be apparent behind the frame in the rabbet. Now sometimes you'd think, well, those cut marks should be visible on the back, but actually a lot of frame makers, I know Eli Wilner and Company, for example, makes a practice of often essentially laminating the verso of frames, whether they're replicas or alterations, with old wood. Now their intention is not to deceive the client, but just to make the back look like a beautiful period surface. So you really want to make a point of looking inside the rabbet, the cross section, if you will, and see if you can discern that there's something that's been put over the outermost surface, and you can sort of see the history or the geology, you will, of the frame inside. So for example, if you have a beautiful frame that has been altered, but it's been beautifully done, that will not decrease the value in a way that a frame being altered and having painful cuts and evidence and that sort of thing. Is the frame a common design or a rare design? It speaks for itself. I mean, there are many frame companies. Foster Brothers of Boston is one that comes to mind. Newcomb Macklin is another company where they had both a repertoire of styles that they would generate in a certain quantity, and then they also had really beautiful, one-of-a-kind or very infrequently crafted, very special designs. So obviously those would be in different classes. Is the frame by a known maker? Is it signed and or inscribed in any way? Regrettably, most 19th century frames were identified, if at all, by paper labels by their makers, and very few of those survive. Whenever we would find a frame with a label on it, it was a cause of great celebration and a cause to document the label. It's, of course, provides you with marvelous clues about the origin of the frame. It's really a wonderful boon. So you would want to know. Then also, in the early years of the 20th century, there were the arts and crafts frames where there are a great many artist frame makers who actually would inscribe, carve in the back of their frames their name, sometimes the date, and I'll show you an example of that. Similarly, a company like Foster Brothers had a very distinctive round brass medallion that they put on the back of their frames. So whenever you have anything that is attributable to a particular company or a specific maker, that's very, very much worth noting, and can often be will lend to its value in your assessment. Is the frame of a standard or common size or of monumental scale? Obviously, this should go without saying. If you're assessing a frame that has an opening of 12 by 20 inches as opposed to 60 by 80 inches, then the size will factor in to the overall value. I can tell you that in the 19th century in America, there was very little standardization in size. 12 by 20 is one size that you're likely to see in the horizontal format for landscape paintings, but there really was not a lot of uniformity. There were standard sizes in French painting, but it really wasn't until the very latter years of the 19th century and into the 20th century where you start seeing standard sizes that we are familiar with today, 18 by 24, 16 by 20, 30 by 40, things like that. So that also lends itself to why a lot of frames that were period frames that were married to paintings that weren't original to the picture, that had to be altered. Are there any questions at this juncture? Okay. Alrighty. Oh, I also wanted to mention, and I'm thrilled to hear that Eli Wilner and Company gave you a copy of The Gilded Edge. The Gilded Edge, among other things, in the back, it has a really terrific section with a glossary and drawings of joining techniques, and it will be a wonderful resource to you. It's really important to be able to speak clearly and to describe what it is that you're looking at, or if you're writing an appraisal report. One of my great resources over the years is a wonderful book. It's a Dover book called The Illustrated Dictionary of Architecture. And many frames, most frames are actually ultimately derived from architecture. So you can find a lot of terms that are essentially architectural terms, but they're really useful to you in describing frames. There's also a book called The Illustrated Dictionary of Architecture, and the author is Cyril, C-Y-R-I-L, last name Harris, H-A-R-R-I-S. And as an aside, I do have your registrations, and I have everyone's contact information and email. I will put together a short bibliography for you of good resource books. I'll put that together and I'll email it to you, let's say within 2 weeks' time. Yes? Oh, okay. All righty. There are, as you might imagine, or you may have discovered in trying to study frames, it's still a rather esoteric discipline. It can be really difficult to find material to learn. That's not so much the case as it was 25 or 30 years ago, but it can still be challenging. So over the years, I've garnered a list of articles and books and reference books and things like that that are really terrific. I have a most lengthy and comprehensive one, but also I'll give you a distilled version that might be the most helpful. One of the other books I wanted to mention is called Italian Renaissance Frames. It's a publication from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it has 3 authors. It's Timothy Newberry, Larry Cantor, that's Cantor with a K-A-N-T-E-R, and George Basaka. And aside from going into detail on a number of very early Renaissance frames, in the back there's a terrific, also a glossary there. That is more rarefied and highbrow. There are a lot of terms like cyma recta, antipendium, things like this. And what I always say is that these are useful and helpful terms, but if they are so rarefied that the person on the receiving end of your report doesn't know what it is, it's not really helpful. You really want to be able to illuminate what it is. And clearly, any report you're going to want to generate will have visuals to go with it to make that clear. But if it's a really exotic architectural term, I would encourage you not to use it. And so that's one of the reasons the glossary and the Gilded Edge, for example, is really useful, because it's more hands-on, laurel leaf and berry and things like that. There's another Wilner publication. This came out, I think it's 90. The original edition was in 95, and then it was reprinted. This is what the second edition looks like in 1999. It's no longer in print, but I'm sure you might be able to find it on Abe Books or that kind of thing. It's really a terrific resource. It very systematically goes through American frames from the very latter part of the 18th century through the mid-20th century. And it illustrates, and most of the illustrations are in black and white. That. And then there are a few pages in the center that have some really beautiful color illustrations. And then you'll find in here it also has some of those same drawings that are in the back of the Gilded Edge, which are joining techniques, and here we are in different profiles and shapes of frames. It's really an excellent resource. We'll talk a bit about the prices that are cited in here as we get a little further along. This still, even these many years later, is a good reference as sort of the high watermark of frames. These are really, really best case high-end valuations. So it's still, even though it's these many years later, it's still a really valuable book, and it's helpful to you as a general guideline in terms of pricing. So highly recommended.
Sorry, by Wilner you mean the publishing house?
This was published by Avon, and it was part of something called the Confident Collector Series. And I'll leave it here. It's a long title. It's Antique American Frames, Identification and Price Guide. And the author is Eli Wilner with Mervyn Kaufman. I would mention to you on page, I believe it's 95 or 96. There is an error on page 96 that has a description, and the picture that it shows is not correct. It's describing a beautiful picture that you could easily find on the internet. It's a painting by Abbott Thayer of an angel, and it's in an exquisite tabernacle frame by Stanford White. And that's what the caption is discussing. But the picture is of another Stanford White frame design entirely, so just a word of caution. And the frame, it says courtesy of Gold Leaf Studios. So just be aware that there's a little disconnect there. I wasn't aware of that myself. I just found it by accident the other night. But great book. Highly recommend it. All righty. So I know that you visited the studio this morning and probably learned more than you knew when you went in, hopefully. But I want to review a little bit about how the frames were made. Are you able to see the screen? How frames were made in the 19th century. So up until the very latter years of the 18th century, frames were carved, completely carved. But in the latter years of the 18th century, the Scottish architect Robert Adam, who was living and working in England, essentially rediscovered a material called composition. People call it compo for short. And composition is a mixture of chalk, hide glue, linseed oil, and resin. And rather than being a poured material like plaster, it would actually make a moldable putty. And it was used to actually embellish rooms, like you see there on the left. That's a period room at the Met, whether it was over a window or a doorway, near a mantelpiece, radiating out from a light fixture in the ceiling. But almost immediately, frame makers realized what a boon it would be to frame making. And they utilized these reversed carved molds. These were carved boxwood. And on a typical 19th century frame, it would be several different pieces of wood that were all joined together to create a rather complex profile. And then that profile would be embellished. Now, this is an image of a frame before it's been gilded with the compo on it. And you can actually, can't really see, I was going to say you can tell. But so basically, these are sections of wood, and then any kind of decorative element on this. This is called a ribbon and stick or a banderole, and this beautiful Moorish design. All of these decorative components that are on the frame were actually from this compo mold. And the compo, because it was a moldable putty, when it came, what they would do is they would take the mold, they would press compo into it, put a thin board on it, on top, and that would go into a press. It'd be, screwed down so it was super tight, and it was strictly a function of pressure. It had nothing to do with temperature or length of time. But it would squeeze it tightly and get that compo into all the little interstices. And these molds were incredibly intricately carved. I mean, you would think, oh, it's molded, but actually they were extraordinarily detailed and quite beautiful, and took a lot of skill to carve these reverse molds. But when they would, so then when they'd take it out of the press, they'd invert it, they'd lift off the mold, and then slice that strip of ornament off so it's still soft and pliable. So when they had an area like this, for example, that was rounded, they could actually drape the piece around it. Or similarly, on a section like this, they created lengths of the ornament that were called stretchers and shrinkers, and they could condense down a passage of ornament to get a little, like 1/8 of an inch less or 1/8 of an inch more, that wasn't visible to the naked eye, but it would allow ornaments to resolve beautifully at the corners. Nowadays they make length molding where it's chop and join, and you might see, a stem growing out of the petal of a flower, that sort of thing. In fine 19th century frames, you would never see that. They were certainly made with molds, but they were very carefully and beautifully composed. When you get to the early years of the 20th century, always say things are cyclical and the pendulum swings back and forth. It was a reaction against industrialization and mechanization, and actually the creation of things like length molding, where they did chop and join and they didn't carefully compose things. And a lot of artists, this was certainly also in concert with the arts and crafts movement, where artists and artist frame makers would carve frames, would design and carve frames. And this is a beautiful frame by Foster Brothers of Boston that had suffered a lot of water damage, so all the surfaces has been removed. But this just shows you what a beautifully carved frame would look like without the gilded surface. So, and in contrast to a more typical 19th century frame that would have the wooden substrate and then molded and applied ornament. So the other thing that's really helpful, we were talking about turn the frame over or look at the back. Aside from just giving yourself a sense of the age of the frame, there are different methods of joining, and I believe these joining techniques are elucidated in the Gilded Edge, and they certainly are. Also, there are 4 of them are illustrated in here. But the joining techniques can also provide clues about the origin of the frame. For example, in this back, it's a little tough to see, but what this is illustrating are what are called lap joints. And a lap joint is where one piece comes straight down and there's no angled miter and then goes across. And then, no, I apologize, this isn't a lap joint, take it back. This is a conventional miter, but then there's a spline that's been inserted at an angle. We'll see another example of that in a minute. Usually when you see these diagonal splines done this way at a right angle to the miter at the corner, this is typical of French frames. Also, if you see frames like this one, see this is another shot of the same kind of internal spline. You can see that a little better. Over the centuries, really, they've explored many different ways of joining frames so that the splines, so that the corners don't open up. That said, wood is an organic living material, and depending on the ambient humidity and the time of year and things like that, that wood is going to shrink and expand. So it's sort of a challenging thing to keep abreast of. This is more typical of a 19th century frame, and you can see very clearly here 1, 2, 3, and 4 different sections of wood that are all joined together. There's a pretty typical 45-degree miter. This is very typical of an American frame. This would be more typical of a British frame. This is what we call block corners. Also, you'll notice that this area is recessed, and then these outer sections are raised, and then there's the corner, block corner. This notion of having them recessed like that allowed them to not have so much wood over the entire frame. The overall object didn't have to be quite so heavy, and that block was also, another conceit, another way to try to keep those splines together, and it was very popular in Britain.
This is English, you say?
Correct. Yeah. It's on strike. There we go. Now, this is much like the ones we were just looking at with the diagonal spline, but what I want you to notice in this slide is that the grain of the wood is very apparent. That's because the wood is oak. And oak was the wood of choice in 18th century France, which was the zenith of wood carving. It's hard to believe because oak is such a hard wood, so difficult to work with. But when you see oak and it appears to you that the frame is carved, and we'll talk about how you might recognize that in a moment. And certainly with that diagonal spline, that's two reasons right there that you should be thinking this is probably a French frame.
Did you say 18th century?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Now this is a very distinctive spline. I don't know if you can see it. It's another spline, but instead of being inserted at the angle, it spans the miter at the corner. This style of miter is specific to a company called Newcomb Macklin, the Newcomb Macklin Company. And Newcomb Macklin was very active here in America in the early years of the 20th century. And many frames, often their frames are identified. There's just sort of like a black stamp that will say Newcomb Macklin Company. Sometimes there are labels. But generally, if you see this kind of spline, you can feel confident that this is a Newcomb Macklin frame. That said, Newcomb Macklin, as I mentioned earlier, had a repertoire of styles that they made. They had salesmen that navigated all across the country, that did big business in frames, and they had a repertoire of styles that were generated in standard sizes, many in metal leaf, which we'll discuss in a moment. And so there are sort of different levels of quality in Newcomb Macklin frames to be aware of. Now, the gilding process, I'm sure, did any of you try gilding when you were out of the studio this morning? It's rather awe-inspiring, isn't it? It looks easy enough, but it's one of those things, you're inclined to just hold your breath, when it's being done. This is just a visual aid that I had made a number of years ago that show the different steps in the water gilding process. And it's just showing at the far left the plain wood. The next section is just that thin layer of gesso. So gesso is the white plaster-like substance, not to be confused with compo. Gesso is more of a thin, watery, liquid mixture, more like plaster. And it's just calcium carbonate and water and a little bit of hide glue. And in a water gilded surface, they'll paint the surface in the white gesso and let it dry, and then sand it down, and then paint it again and let it dry and sand it down. It's usually around 8 coats of this, painting it on, drying, and sanding. This builds up a really beautiful but very thin, not even a 1/16 even after those 8 coats, a very thin surface. And what that does is it covers over the wood grain and also creates a very thin, smooth, but porous surface. And then the next step in the gilding, in the water gilding process, is to paint the surface with bole, B-O-L-E, which is a kind of liquid clay. And what we're all most used to seeing is the red, that sort of terracotta red that pokes through. But bole came in many different colors. You can see here there's an ochre color, the terracotta, a sort of gray color, and a blue. Much like the joining techniques, the color of clay under the gold leaf is often also an indicator about country of origin. For example, in the United States in the 19th century, the clay layer was almost always this gray-blue color. And in France in the 19th century, it was almost always this terracotta red. Now, that changes in the early years of the 20th century here in America when they went to carving frames, when they left the applied ornament behind and went to carving, they started using the red clay. My hunch is that some of the frame makers who started to carve frames were actually looking at earlier designs, earlier, more historical designs that had red clay, so they were inclined to use the red clay. The gold leaf is in fact translucent. So whatever color of bole was used would absolutely inform the final tonality of the gilded surface. Now, it's very important that you know that there are 2 kinds of gold leaf, or 2 kinds of leaf might be a better way to say it. The first thing you'll notice here is the difference in size. On the left is a packet of metal leaf, sometimes called composition leaf, and it's about 5 inches square. On the right is a book of gold leaf, and it's about 3 1/4 inches square. Now, the smaller 3 1/4 inch square leaf is the finer product. It's generally gold leaf with little bits of silver added, and the amount of silver in relationship to the gold will determine, is it 23 3/4 carat, which is a nice warm gold, or is it 18 carat or 16 carat. So when it gets to a lower number like that, the color of the gold is much paler. So a 16 carat leaf would be a very silvery value of gold. And there you see the two. Now, the metal leaf, by contrast, is made with base metals, copper, aluminum, and bronze. And so that will age differently. Gold leaf will not oxidize and tarnish. It does not change color over the years. Sometimes, not frequently, but sometimes there might be a varnish or sealer on the surface that discolors, but the gold leaf will not, as a rule. However, metal leaf, the leaf made with base metals, does oxidize and tarnish because it's the copper and the bronze. So it becomes darker, it has a decidedly more coppery color to it. And it's far less expensive, as you imagine, than gold leaf, whereas many years ago, for example, a book of gold leaf might be $35 or $40, and the book of gold leaf or metal leaf might be $4. I mean, big difference. And in the early years, we thought that that was strictly an economical driver of the choice of leaf. But after framing a lot of particularly ashcan and early 20th century American pictures where they were experimenting with different palettes, we found that a lot of paintings were actually much happier in this warmer, coppery value of leaf. So it is not fair to say that it was strictly just because it was less expensive. There's also a very subtle texture in metal leaf that you don't get in gold leaf. When you gild the surface, you lay the gesso and you lay the gold leaf on, you get this beautiful smooth surface. In metal leaf, it's almost, I say it's a lot like skin if you look carefully. You know, there's little texture in your skin. Metal leaf has that. If you take a piece of metal leaf and you just sort of wad it up, you end up with this little wad, a little gold wad of leaf. If you were to take a piece of gold leaf and do that, it would disintegrate in your hands. It would essentially disappear. So very important to be aware of what kind of leaf is appropriate at different periods of time. So for example, on most 19th century frames, it would be very, very unusual to find metal leaf on the surface. So, and this is unfortunately something you see in inferior or inappropriate restorations and repairs, where someone might take a beautiful fluted cove frame from the 1860s and regild it with metal leaf. And it's garish and it's the wrong shade and it's just not good. Yes?
What period, what time, what date would you say that the metal leaf started to appear in the finishes of the frames?
In what frames?
In whatever.
In all frames. Well, metal leaf dates back to the Renaissance. It's not a new material, but it was not in very wide use. You do tend to see metal leaf, as a rule, used more starting in the early years of the 20th century. So, have you ever seen on a frame, a lot of times on the sides where you see the stripes, leaf marks on a frame? What that is, it's just where one piece of leaf overlaps with the next, and you're looking at 2 layers of gold leaf. But that's good to notice, because if you see that and you see that those marks are 5 inches apart, you know you're looking at metal leaf, because the gold leaf is not going to be that wide. So just little clues like that are helpful. This just shows you in the different steps of the water gilding process. This is a frame that has been painted with the gesso and the bowl. So they've used this ochre color of bowl and then the highlights in the gray and blue bits of clay that are added on highlights. And so the use of ochre bowl, a lot of times you'll see where a frame is completely painted over with the ochre color bowl, and then there are just areas that have red or blue clay. That's because the ochre bowl, if you're laying leaf and you get a little tear or a pinhole, it's not so prominent if a color like red or blue would be showing through. So it's a good base color to use. And then after that leaf is applied, this is a gilder with a gilder's tip applying gold leaf to a surface. That's how the leaf is laid down. The term water gilding comes from a part of the process that's not in evidence here. There's a mixture of water, hide glue, and denatured alcohol. It's referred to as gilder's liquor. And so after the gesso, after the clay is on and it's dry, and just when you're ready to lay the leaf, you'll just take a brush and you'll brush the surface with this gilder's liquor, and then immediately thereafter lay the leaf on. And so the water helps that leaf to grab to the surface of the frame, and then especially with the alcohol in it, the water dissipates and the gold melds to the surface of the object. That's why it's called water gilding. I've always thought that was interesting because water is an enemy of a beautiful gilded surface. The last thing you ever want to do is take something wet to the surface of a gilded object, because it'll just take it right off oftentimes. So after that's applied, you have two options. After the gold leaf is laid on, you can burnish the surface. That's what's happening there on the left. Did you all see burnishing being done out at the studio? And you saw that the tool, it looks like a paintbrush, but instead of bristles, it's actually agate stones in the end. And those come in different shapes and sizes, made to conform to the different surfaces and ornaments and shapes that they'll be burnishing. It's literally done just about a square inch at a time. And that's what makes the surface shiny and reflective. And the reason that happens is that the clay, the bowl, through the gold is being polished. That was a revelation to me when I understood that. So it's the polishing of the bowl through the gold leaf that makes it shiny and reflective. The alternative is to take cotton balls, and just rub the surface, and you get a beautiful matte gold. So most frames are actually somewhat complex and sophisticated combinations of both matte and burnished surfaces. The gilding schemes will employ both of them very intentionally in order to really bring up all the different nuances in the ornament. Now, I don't have pictures, but I want to mention another method of applying leaf. So we have two kinds of gold, or two kinds of leaf, the metal and the gold leaf, and then we have two methods of applying them. So the one, the gold standard, no pun intended, is the water gilding. But there is also a method of gilding referred to as oil gilding. And the oil gilding, instead of brushing the surface with water, you often have similar preparatory layers. But instead of water, there's a viscous oil size that's painted on the surface that uses oil as part of its base. It's painted on, it gets sticky. You let it, in the treatise as you read it says, allow to dry to sufficient tack. And what that means is to the right amount of stickiness. And so you let it dry, and then when the leaf is laid on, it grabs it down. And it's on and adhered. You don't burnish it. You can't burnish it. It'll punch a hole in it. And it just is matte. You don't have to do anything to the surface in terms of rubbing it down like you would in a water gilded surface. And it's especially well suited because of that to areas that have a lot of topography, if you will. So in addition to burnished and matte surfaces, what you also might see on picture frames are combinations of both water and oil gilding. So it wouldn't be unusual for a really elaborate floral surface, for example, to have oil gilding to adhere the leaf, and then other passages that are burnished or beautiful matte surfaces might be water gilding. Now this is noteworthy because if you try to remove like an oil-based paint. Maybe it's somewhere along the line the frame was painted with oil-based paint. You know, there's these little jars that are called liquid leaf of liquid paint. Well, there is no such thing as liquid leaf. What that is just oil-based paint with powdered gold suspended in it. And if you use something that will cut through the oil of that paint and you're on an oil gilded surface, it's going to take the original gilded surface up with it. On the other hand, if someone has put gold paint on a smooth water gilded surface, you could take that off and the remaining gold underneath will be intact. Oil gilding is often used in architectural settings too, whether on a dome of a building or statuary, sculpture, things like that as well. Now, this isn't a body on the steps. It's what I'd like to think is a well-intentioned cleaning effort. I like to show this picture, to make a point. This picture, I believe, is taken in Italy. It's probably some remarkable artwork. But it's just a note of all the many ways that frames can sustain damage. And as I mentioned earlier, water damage is a special problem to gilded surfaces. This is a frame that shows is a really good example of telltale water damage. Many times you'll see frames and artworks that were stored in the basement, which is the worst place because it's generally damp. And the reason water and dampness is anathema to a gilded surface is because of that preparatory layer of gesso. It's porous. So if it gets wet, it's going to pull in all that moisture. And then when it dries, it just turns to dust. It disintegrates. And that's what's going on in this frame. You can see here where the water came pouring down and then hit these layers. By the same token, this is a beautiful frame. It happened to have a beautiful label on the back. It has 80 to 90% of its original gilded surface intact. And so it would be really important when the frame were restored that whoever does the work, in addition to recreating the surface and the structure and any ornament that's been lost or destroyed, that when they gild it, that they gild only those damaged areas, the restored areas, and match that to the rest of the frame's original surface. It's a really difficult thing to do. It's the hallmark of a really gifted restorer who can do that. But it's important because just like someone who might completely restore a frame and gild a frame with metal leaf that would have never seen metal leaf, a lot of times you'll see somebody who can't get it to match and they just end up regilding the whole frame so that they get a uniform surface. But that's really a tragedy to lose all that original surface. It's something you really want to preserve. So again, from the standpoint of appraising and looking at frames out in the field, you want to be wary of this. You might see a frame that's a really beautiful frame, but the surface is just all wrong, and that's generally something that's a function of an inadequate restoration effort. Similarly, at the top left, you'll see that very thing going on where a frame's being worked on and just isolated areas are being painted with the gesso and large expanses of the original surface and the gilded surface are left intact and not treated. And then also in the bottom section, they're working rechasing, articulating ornaments, using tools a lot like a dentist might use, really fine things. You'll see this sometimes in restorations also, where they might put pieces of ornament back in a frame and then they paint a whole new layer of gesso on top of the whole thing. They don't take it down and recreate it. It just goes on top, and what happens is the ornament becomes mushy and ill-defined and you lose an entire generation of crispness. So this is something also to be wary of. So you'll see this sometimes. I know in museums you'll see it fairly often where a frame and you look at it and you say something's off, and it's just the whole thing, it's just mushy, and that's generally what's happened. There's been an additional layer of gesso put on top. It hasn't been articulated. How's everybody doing? Any questions? Okay. Now to get into styles of frames that you're likely to see. This is an example of a beautiful, spectacular frame. This is at the Frick collection. This is an example of some of the finest French frames. There are a great many Louis frames, if you will. A little plug here. If you have occasion to be in Los Angeles between now and I think the 3rd or 4th of January, they have a small focus exhibition on the Louis frames at the Getty. Wonderful opportunity to see great examples of those. So these were the finest frames. Now it's interesting too because you'll see a fabulous French frame on a Renaissance painting, on a Northern European painting like a Rembrandt. You'll think, well, that doesn't make sense. Shouldn't it be a black frame? And usually when you see that, it speaks in part to patronage. A great many of the purchasers of this Northern European art at the time were the aristocracy in France, and so they were putting these beautiful, elaborate French frames on pictures. So this would be one example of those. And here, for example, is a lovely Italian frame. This is also at the Frick. This is a beautiful carved Italian frame. Now it's funny, now in our world we refer to these as Italian frames, but you know, Italy was a construct of just a number of decades ago. It used to be city-states. There's Bologna, Venezia, Roma, and so really, if you really get into the study of Italian frames, you're really, oh, am I looking at something that's Bolognese or Venetian? I mean, these distinctions become more important if you're going deep on European frames. This is one that you're likely to see. This is known as a Murata frame. A lot of frames get names generally associated with an artist, and not necessarily because the artist made the frame or even designed the frame necessarily, but often because it was a style of frame that that particular artist utilized on their artworks. And there are Carlo Murata and Salvatore Rosa frames, and they're all versions of this where it's a very similar profile, and then there's this leafy acanthus and often a twist motif. You can see it in detail at left. This style of frame is enormously popular to be used on portraits, things like this. It's also very widely reproduced. It's one of the styles you'll see more frequently reproduced in varying levels of quality and sophistication than many other styles. So the Carlo Murata, the difference between a Murata and a Rosa, or in Britain sometimes they'll talk about a semi-Carlo or a half Carlo, and what they're really talking about here is where this leafy acanthus pattern resides and how it's large, if it's just an adjunct or it's the primary ornament, that kind of thing. But they're all of a type. They have the same profile, and then they're embellished with this leafy acanthus pattern.
Sorry, what was the other name? Murata?
Carlo Murata and Salvatore Rosa, R-O-S-A.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to French frames, this is a picture of a Pissarro, Camille Pissarro painting. Now here we're talking about the late 19th century, but we're looking at a frame that's more typical of that elaborate 18th century frame we were just looking at on the Rembrandt. And the reason for that is twofold. You all realize that when the Impressionists first started promoting their work and making their work, they were considered radically different. And so there were dealers. One was Paul Auguste Durand-Ruel in Paris, who was really championing the Impressionist work. Well, here's a person who was used to selling artwork to collectors who would more frequently be in these elaborate Louis frames. So if you think about it, a frame is context. So if you take something radical and different and you put it in a more familiar context, a more accessible design, it makes it easier for someone to be receptive to it. So this was partly a marketing ploy, There are some fascinating writings, even about Pizarro, where Pizarro designed a frame that was much simpler, very little ornament on it. Much of it was painted, just had a little tiny bit of gold leaf on it, and this was his preferred frame style for his artworks. And he would send it to the dealer for exhibition, and he'd say, no, we can't, I'm sorry, we can't keep these frames. They won't sell if we put them in these frames that you want. We have to put them in this sort of frame. So you need to be wary about these for two reasons. Is one, you want to know, you might be looking at a really spectacular 18th century frame on an Impressionist artwork or an early 20th century artwork. Or you might be, more likely, looking at a later reproduction of such a frame. And not to dissuade you, but there are a variety of Louis styles, and there are the reproductions of them are legion. And some are carved on spindle carving machines, but most of them are molded and applied ornament in varying degrees of delicacy and faithfulness. So you'll go, every museum, it seems like, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I keep talking about the Met, but they're such a great resource for us here in this area. You'll go to the Lehman Wing, for example, and 9 out of 10 Impressionist paintings are in these Louis frames. And it is fascinating to me because this is really counter to what most of these artists did want. They were very big on white frames due to color theory and things like that. So it would behoove you to, as I said, to go to, whether it's a frame dealer or to go to the museums, especially the Frick, to see really fine examples of these really fine 18th century French frames, and then to notice all the different iterations of them that come after, and their varying degrees of intricacy and execution. Now, in American art, we talked about how frames in the 19th century were wood with compo. Well, that is true for the most part, but when we were starting at the late 18th century, this is a good example. This is a painting by John Singleton Copley, and this is a very elaborate, lacy, completely carved frame. It's derived from English styles. It's tempting when there's a frame. A lot of times in the biz, people say a Copley frame, and if someone tells you they want a Copley frame, you can pretty much be certain that they're referring to a frame like this. But many artists, Copley among them, didn't have just one style of frame that they used, and that's what should go on everything. We learned this, for example, in the case of Thomas Eakins, who made a great many beautiful, very simple wood frames, ungilded frames, or they were gilded without gesso, so you see the grain of the wood going through. So someone decided, well, we're going to put this simple wood frame in all the Eakins paintings. Well, that was wrong. I mean, this was specific to a group of portraits in the early years of the 20th century. Many of his more important paintings or not even more important, but his earlier paintings were framed in what you would think of as a more salon-style frame, a more elaborate frame. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that one artist, one frame style, that's it. There are usually a number of them. But as you did move forward into the 19th century, you got simpler frames, and it's also important to remember the correspondence. You know, these are evolving architectural and decorative styles. So there is a relationship to what sort of furniture is coming out of that period as to what the frames would be like. So here's a beautiful portrait by William Sidney Mound from 1820, and I've just put for an example on the left is a suite of beautiful, refined furniture by Duncan Phyfe. You know, spare lines, very simple, elegant lines. And so a portrait would have a simple cove molding like this. You might have a shell or a leaf, just a simple ornament at the corners, but generally very simple, a nice cove molding.
That's the earlier 19th century?
Correct. Earliest part of the 19th century. Well, you know, that pendulum that I'm talking about that swings from side to side, you know, it went from this spare Duncan Fife furniture and beautiful simple lines, and then the Rococo revival came along, and Belter, for example, introduced this Belter furniture with laminated rosewood, and everything was curves and nuts and leaves and vines and berries, sinuous ornament. And you can see even over the mantle in that period room on the left, that over mantle is anything but understated. The Rococo revival, among other things, did celebrate the natural world, and that's when you're more inclined to see naturalistic elements. And the picture on the right by Thomas Cole is a good example, where now instead of portraiture, that's another thing to consider, is not just the commensurate architectural and decorative trends, but also what kind of artwork is being framed. So really in the early years of the 19th century it was portraiture, and then it evolved and turned into landscape painting. So here's a beautiful little Thomas Cole painting, actually a bit of trompe-l'oeil. It looks like a piece of canvas tacked on a wood board, but it's all the painting. He's painted that trompe-l'oeil effect. But now this is very densely embellished with a lot of floral and vegetal forms that oftentimes will echo and reinforce the elements of the composition. As you move further into the century, then the neoclassical ornament becomes more popular. This is on a painting by Worthington Whitridge, and this is a kind of frame that's referred to as a fluted cove. And the reason is on these frames you can see these parallel lines. Reeds are convex, just like a bundle of reeds would be. Flutes are this way. So fluted cove just means that it's the flutes, it looks like lines, in the cove. Now this one, more than being just a cove, is what we would call in a profile the OG, the S curve. So these fluted cove frames, there are also a number of versions, a number of expressions of that form. Some are where it's just a cove and others where it's an S shape. Generally when you see the S shape in a fluted cove style frame, or we still call it fluted cove even though it's a fluted OG to be specific, the OG tends to come later, more like the 1870s and later, whereas in the 1860s it would be just the cove, just the scoop. The other thing that's very popular during this period, the sort of quintessential fluted cove frame, would be a scoop with the flutes, and then this is laurel leaf and berry ornament that overlaps. And you see laurel leaf and berry appear in the 1860s, and then it's ubiquitous thereafter, over and over again. So if you're looking at a fluted cove frame and it has leaf and berry on it, you can pretty much be certain that it's not 1850 or earlier. So little bits like that, and that's one of the points that this price guide book that I was talking about earlier, the little one, it goes into a lot of this that we're covering today in detail, so it's a good resource for you. Now this is a little bit later. This is called the Hatch family. This is by Eastman Johnson. And it's a similar kind of frame that we started talking about in the beginning, where there are complex bits of wood, or there are many bits of wood to create the complex profile. And then all the decorative embellishments are that molded and applied compo. But in this frame, instead of the foliate forms, it's more of a geometric pattern. It's sort of a spade shape, and this is called an anthemion. And this is because then genre and interior scenes become more prevalent, and so what these design elements in the frame are echoing are elements in the composition, where it might be the lighting fixture, the architecture of the table, the patterns in the carpet, the architecture of the room. So little subtleties like that. Now this is really significant to talk about because it's something you may see. And what you're looking at here at first blush might seem to be just another kind of period frame with a simpler design to it. But what this is just the inner section of the frame. It's missing its entire outer component. This is what we call the liner. Now the liner can often be just this portion, just that innermost flat. But because of the way these frames were made that we were talking about, it's not unusual on a typical 19th century frame for the liner to be 2 or 3 different strips and passages. And then there's a larger decorative piece that wraps around that. And over the years, a number of these get removed, and then they'll be hanging. Whoops. This picture was taken in a museum. And I'm sorry to say it's not all that unusual to see. And actually, oftentimes you can look at these, and on the side, sometimes they've been painted gold, or sometimes they're not even painted, but you can see that it's raw wood. And so there's a whole outer portion that's missing from this frame. In fact, if we just go back and look at that Johnson, see, it would be this frame. It would be from here in. So this whole primary outer element has been removed. So it's just the inner edge. So you really want to make sure when you're looking at something to examine the edges, make sure it's a complete frame, because it's not entirely unusual to find just the inner liner. In fact, if you go to the Met, to the American Paintings Galleries, there's a big, beautiful, large painting by William Lamb McPicknell called The Banks of the Wang, and it's looking down a river scene. It's a pretty big size picture, large horizontal. If you look at it closely, I'm here to tell you that the inner liner, which is at least 6 inches wide, maybe wider, the inner liner is original. You can see where it's been abraded. There's some of that gray clay that shows through. And then that whole primary, more foliate outer element is actually a replica that's been wrapped around the period liner. And I know about that because at Eli Wilner and Company, they worked on that project and did that, where, you know, for many years, the Picknell had been hanging on in just its liner. And they decided that they wanted to have the frame be complete. And they were so, well, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That beautiful liner is much worth preserving. So we'll just replicate an appropriate outer element and wrap it around the liner. Now this is a style, it's referred to as Barbizon style frame. And it's interesting that the Barbizon style is actually derived from an earlier 18th century French design. And the Barbizon frame originated in France, and that's how it got that name. A great many of the French Barbizon painters favored this style of frame for their work. And then that style became popular here in America, so there are many both French and American versions of the Barbizon style, and they're all characterized. This is a soft, rounded, convex profile, and then this is a really lovely combination of acanthus leaves and what's called strap work that all embellish it. And again, you might see a number of Barbizon frames. So is there red clay underneath? Is there gray clay underneath? And how is the frame joined in the back? So you're trying to determine, am I looking at a French Barbizon frame or an American Barbizon frame? Some of those things would be helpful clues. This is very typical of the 1880s. William Merritt Chase was a big fan of frames. He used a number of different styles. He was especially fond of the Barbizon style frame for a lot of his Shinnecock paintings. Then special frame makers to be aware of. Stanford White certainly stands head and shoulders above them. In the 1890s, Stanford White, most known as an architect of the firm McKim, Mead & White, designed frames. He didn't do it as a matter of business. He's quoted as saying, "I've never designed frames for money." He did it, his list of friends reads like a who is who of American art. And so he designed a great many frames, and this is one of them. This is referred to as the grill style. There's a terrific chapter in the book that you got this morning that talks in great detail about White and his frame designs. This is one style. This is the grill design. There were a number. These are Stanford White designs. Now, White was killed in 1906, And a number of years later, 6 to 10 years later, these frame designs ended up in the possession of the Newcomb Macklin Company, and they advertised, the frame designs of Stanford White. We've never been able to determine how those came into the possession of Newcomb Macklin, and that's very important. Am I looking at a Stanford White style frame that was made during White's lifetime, under his control and supervision, or am I looking at a copy that was made 10 and 20 years after his death without the same kind of supervision? They're generally not the same quality. This is a spectacular version. This would be a good example of what I was referring to, where there are sort of two kinds, where there are certain styles that were made frequently over and over, and much like the girl frame or some of those other designs, or this one. This is a very special frame. This is also at the Met. This is on a Thomas Wilmer doing Tobit and the Angel, and it's actually, the title of the painting is incised right there onto the liner, and this is a really beautiful combination of, again, classic architectural elements that are just combined to beautiful effect. You'll notice too there's a garland, a swag, if you will, that goes across the top and comes down each side. So, really beautifully composed, and worth going to the museum and seeing these. This is the tabernacle style frame I was telling you about that should be the illustration on that page 96 and isn't. Stanford White was a big fan of the Italian Renaissance, so a lot of the decorative elements in his frames, and then he also designed a lot of tabernacle frames, which are all from the Italian Renaissance. So this is one of them. There were many different styles of tabernacle frames that White designed for a number of pictures, and these are all quite special. Now, certainly it didn't switch at the turn of the century, at the year 1900, but it's a good way to think of it as a turning point from frames which were made with a wooden substrate and molded at applied ornament, and then frames that went to being all carved. I just put a shot of the Frank Lloyd Wright room up there to underscore the simplicity of the frame designs. This is a Metcalf painting that has a kind of frame that's known as a cassetta frame. Now, cassetta is an Italian term. It means little box, and it's referring to the cassetta profile, which is a flat panel and then has raised inner and outer edges that sort of create a little box. That's what the origin of the term is. Well, the Boston artist and frame maker Herman Dudley Murphy loved frames and was traveling in Europe, and after he came home, he wanted to design and make frames, but he couldn't afford to hire someone to do it. So he bought all the necessary equipment and taught himself to carve and gild. And it was Murphy that introduced this cassetta style of frame. And I can put these a little out of order. So the cassetta style, through Murphy's lens, was like this one, where it has the flat panel and then any decorative embellishment was carved at the outer corner. Now, one of the remarkable things that Murphy did after he made that frame design was he turned it over and he signed and dated it. He was a big fan of Whistler and borrowed certain aspects of Whistler. Whistler was also a Celt, and Murphy was a Celt, and he was from an area in Ireland called Carrigrohane, and it means Red Cliff, and that's what he named his studio in Boston, was Carrigrohane, Red Cliff. And in fact, the backs of Murphy's frames are painted in this dark red color, underscoring this red cliff. And then the M with the circle around it was Murphy's cipher, much like Whistler used the butterfly cipher. So it would be EM with the circle around it, 1907, Carrigrohane, and 392. Now, for a long time, we thought that that number was a style number, but it turns out that it actually refers to an order number. And happily, the Carrigrohane papers are on deposit at the Archives of American Art. They've also been microfilmed, so you can look at them here in New York rather than having to go to Washington. And sometimes the entries are very interesting. It'll say child has some winter midnight and the dimensions, and other times it'll be Mrs. Johnson landscape, so you don't always know. But this is a fascinating clue. So again, the number that you'll see inscribed on the Carragher frame is not a style number, but it refers to the order number. Similarly, Murphy didn't only make the cassetta. It was Murphy, though, that introduced the cassetta, and after that, it became very, very widely used, became very popular. If you think about it, this is when American Impressionist paintings were really coming to the fore. There were very different styles of art. They were using different palettes, and so it really called for something very different. And these were all done in many different countless variations of this cassetta profile, where it was a wide flat panel with little or no embellishment. But Murphy also made beautiful frames like this that had gorgeous carving, and they're often characterized by a very luscious, buttery, gilded surface that are just quite beautiful, quite noteworthy. And again, there's another, this is a really early one. There's no order number on it. 1906 is early for Murphy. And then as we move into the 20th century, again, what's happening societally, this is when technology is really coming to the fore. Airplanes, silver, aluminum, things like this are being introduced. This is an Arthur Dove painting in what is a very modest frame, very simple silver frame, probably gilded with aluminum leaf. Arthur Dove was nearly poverty-stricken. He didn't have a lot of money. He did a lot of his frame making and frame gilding on his own, was always exploring. This would be an example where the frame by itself looks like something not especially remarkable, but it would be wise to be familiar with the artist to understand that even though this is a very modest frame, A, it looks wonderful on the picture, and B, it's a frame that not only did Dove choose, but he probably made the frame and put it on the artwork. So it has a lot of cachet and resultant value. This is another silver frame. It's a little hard to tell. It's kind of a warm slide. But silver became very popular. Silver leaf will oxidize and tarnish. That's where I said gold leaf won't tarnish, but silver leaf will, because it's silver and it's exposed to the air. So usually when you see something that's silver gilded, it's either silver leaf that's been sealed somehow, or else it's platinum leaf that's not as inclined to oxidizing and tarnishing, but became a very popular surface. Thomas Hart Benton is one example of an artist who loved the use of silver leaf. And when you can see on these more contemporary scenes, you can see how nice they look. And also the use of, instead of gilding, a painted liner, a painted-in liner. You will see linen liners. We love to hate linen liners. They don't wear very well. It's easy for them to get stained and discolored. They generally did not come onto the scene until the very late 1930s. But you will see linen liners on Impressionist pictures, on all sorts of pictures, because it became very popular after the 1930s and 40s to use linen liners and to put them on artworks. But they're not necessarily a period device. And there have been some museums actually where they've elected to, even if they know the linen liner is original to the picture, they'll elect to remove the linen liner, replace it with a liner that's painted in the same tonality, more of a matte surface, but the same tonality as the linen, just because it's more durable and doesn't stain and discolor. And then also really different, more rough surface treatments. Milton Avery, this is the Milton Avery picture. It's a good example, again, where it looks like a really coarse, rough surface, but it looks terrific. Modernist pictures in particular really love to use this kind of frame where it's painted and scumbled surfaces, marked absence of gilding used in these, but they speak a lot to the simplified modern forms of a lot of these artworks, and also there was a lot more concern with notions of texture and how those played in. Now, the pendulum swinging back and forth. Now, at first glance, this is a John Sloan picture. At first glance, this looks like a carved frame, one of those early 20th century carved frames. But what happened is they went to carving, but then they went back to also using molded and applied ornament because it was expedient, it was cost effective. So let me show you the detail. If you look at this closely, you can see that there are cracks here in the surface. You see this? They're cracking. Now, this is one of the most important things you're going to learn today. In telling apart a carved frame and a frame that's compo ornament, whenever you see cracking that occurs this way, you know you're looking at compo, because if the frame were carved wood, the cracking would be occurring lengthwise along the grain of the wood. It would be an uneven crack, and it would be going along the same angle as the section of wood. Now, whether it's a simple form like this one that's made to look like a simple carved frame, or even those much more elaborate 20th century frames that we were looking at, you'll often see these tiny hairline cracks in compo. And what that is it's just the compo reacting differently to temperature and humidity than the wood to which it's affixed. Most often, the ornament's not loose. You'll see the cracking, but it won't move. And it's just because the compo has created these little fissures, much like shifting geological plates. So it's really helpful when you see cracks like this, because you know I'm looking at compo. Now, also, once you become a little more familiar with styles and what's prevalent during a particular time period, you'll have a better sense of knowing what you look for. So, for example, if you're looking at American pictures from the middle of the 19th century, it would be very, very, very unusual to find a completely carved wood frame in the mid-19th century. The exception to that is Italy. God bless the Italians, they just kept carving. And I always think that's ironic, because actually that compo material originated in Italy in the 15th century. So that's an irony to me, because it was really the Italians who kept carving when so many people gave it up. I want to show you a project that Eli Wilner and Company did a number of years ago to just underscore this notion of fine replicas. There are 3 monumental landscapes. They actually belong to the State Department of the United States, but they're on view at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And each of these is 8 by 14 feet, really quite large. And they knew from period photographs that they had been beautifully framed in period photographs. There were in period frames. There were different dates of the pictures, the 1870s and the 1890s. It's also interesting to know that these paintings actually were part of what, I'll come back to this picture in a minute. Oh, sorry, getting ahead of myself. These paintings by Moran were of Yellowstone, and they were instrumental in the deeming of Yellowstone as a national park. But the museum knew that these were on view in inappropriate frames. I have it here. It should be coming up next. I don't know why it's like out of sequence. There we go. Just got out of whack. This is how they were on view in these narrow strip frames. Now, these 3 monumental frames, no one knew what had become of them, where they went. They looked long and hard and couldn't find them anywhere. Now you kind of think, how could you lose frames that big? But it's not that unusual. Now, so curators are more aware of frames and their importance and not so quick to discard things, but over the years these things happen. Things change. And so they came to Eli Wilner with these period photographs, and the Wilner staff recreated them based on the photographs and also deducing what the moldings would be. Now, interestingly, they came up with a molding width, and they actually had them scale them down still, but they were still enormous. And so, as you might imagine, creating each frame was slightly different. They weren't all matching frames. Getting the frames down there and then up in the galleries with the paintings reframed, going from this to this, you know, was really a profound example. To me, it just always underscores how much happier a painting usually is in a frame from the same period, from the appropriate period. I'm showing you these to underscore the importance of being aware of the fact that you're not unlikely to come across either period frames that have been resized to fit a picture or to look at these fine replicas. I know Eli Wilner, for example, will mark their replicas on the back, so it'll usually indicate that it's a replica. This is a marvelous quote by Charles Wilson Peale, early 19th century. Well, he was many things, an artist, an inventor, a naturalist, a scientist, but I love it, you know, how I should have made that much bigger, shouldn't I? A good picture deserves a good frame, and a bad picture may sometimes preserve its place longer by having a handsome frame. Now, it's amusing to us, but it also makes an important point. When you're looking at artwork, sometimes you might get an artwork that is not particularly valuable. It might have been Aunt Martha's painting, and she was just a hobbyist. But Aunt Martha might have been really wealthy and might have stepped up and put an incredible frame on her artwork. So it's also not unusual sometimes to come across a framed artwork that is where the frame is a much greater frame than the painting that it surrounds. So don't be surprised if you come across that. Now, I haven't said a word about values. I'm sure you're all very interested in valuing things, and I started to try to put together some numbers for you, but I realized as I tried to do that, and of course this book does have a lot of them, and as I said, these are sort of high watermark values, and I can go through some of these styles that we looked at and give you price ranges, but I'm not sure that it serves you entirely well, because it's just like anything else. If you're trying to assign a value, you're really going to want to try to find comparables, just like you would anywhere else. You know, whether you go to companies like Eli Wilner or different companies like that, who can give you examples of what frames bring. I can tell you that most period frames, from the simplest small frame, would start at $5,000 and $6,000 and go up. Some of the really important frames, like Stanford White designs, whether a beautiful rare example of a Stanford White or a Foster Brother, those can go for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000. Stanford White frames, a large tabernacle or something, could be $100,000. Now those prices are more the exception than the rule, but they absolutely can command great prices. Now, the fluted cove style frame, for example, is very, very desirable for Hudson River landscapes. It's a beautiful kind of frame that's the sort of go-to for mid-century. And again, so the size will also factor into it. So a smaller version of a beautiful sort of 1860s, 1870s American frame on the smaller end would be maybe $12,000 and going up to 16, 18, 24, 34, things like that. Those are the kind of numbers that you're looking at. Same thing in the early 20th century when we're looking at these cassetta style frames. There are so many of them. There are the really important signed, dated on the back by Herman Dudley Murphy or other makers, or then there are others, maybe a more generic design that was made by Newcomb Macklin that's gilded in metal leaf and not gold leaf. So where the Murphy frame might fetch $20,000, $30,000 or $40,000 or more, where the simpler Newcomb Macklin might be only, $15,000, $18,000, $24,000, that sort of thing. So period, size, and style would be sort of the three factors in addition to those we discussed, like condition, has the frame been altered or not, that factor into it. Now, over the years, I've been asked many times, how much would you reduce the value of a frame if it's been altered, or if it's been restored, or if it's in poor condition. And I regret that there is not a magic formula that I can't say, oh, 25% across the board. You really have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But as I said, the caveat is certainly if a frame has been, say, insensitively altered or restored, and in the best possible condition, it would be $24,000. It's certainly going to be less. That said, if it's a special period frame, it still has a compelling presence, and so it would be commensurately valued in that regard. For the most part, that's what I want to say about values, but I would be happy to listen to any questions you have, or if there's something specifically you want me to go back and address about values, I'd be happy to do that. I also have put here, you have it on your handout, and I have cards if you'd like one, but I would really welcome you to reach out to me if you have questions. I would be happy to help you in any way, to be a resource for you. I will send you the bibliography that we discussed, of course, but I'm happy to be of value to you, of assistance to you, if I can be helpful to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.